What if I told you there was a man who literally bought an empire? A man so wealthy that Jeff Bezos' fortune would look like pocket change compared to his. A man who held kings hostage with debt and changed the course of European history with a single letter. His name was Jakob Fugger, and with a net worth equivalent to $400 billion, representing 2% of all of Europe's wealth, he was the richest person who ever lived. Yet, somehow, history forgot him. Jakob Fugger was born on March 6, 1459, in Augsburg, Germany. But his story actually begins with his grandmother, Elisabeth Gefädermann. When Jacob's grandfather Hans died in 1408, Elisabeth did something remarkable for medieval times. She took over the family textile business and ran it for 28 years, doubling the family fortune. This wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. By the time Jacob was born, the Fuggers were already prosperous, but they were far from nobility. Jacob's father had been a weaver who traded cloth, and the family was known as the Fuggers of the Lily, after their heraldic badge, distinguishing them from their less successful cousins, the Fuggers of the Deer. Jacob was the youngest of 7 sons. Originally destined for the priesthood, fate had other plans. When his brother Peter died in an epidemic, 14-year-old Jacob was pulled from his religious studies and sent to Venice, the financial capital of the Renaissance world. C-shaped TTR2. Venice in the 1470s was where the future was being invented. It was the gateway between East and West, where spices from India met the gold of Europe, where Islamic mathematics merged with Christian commerce. For over 2 years, Jacob lived in the Fondaco di Tedeschi, the German merchant house on the Grand Canal, just steps from the Rialto Bridge. Here, Jacob learned secrets that would change his life: double entry bookkeeping, a revolutionary accounting method that let him track every ducat with precision. He mastered the art of international trade, learned Italian, and built a network that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea. But most importantly, Jacob learned to think differently about money. In Renaissance Venice, money wasn't just a means to an end, it was power itself. And Jakob Fugger was about to become very powerful. When Jacob returned to Germany, he joined his brothers Ulrich and Georg in running the family business. But Jacob saw opportunities others missed. The late 1400s were a time of constant warfare in Europe, and wars needed one thing above all else: weapons. And weapons needed copper. Jacob made his move in 1487 when Archduke Sigismund of Austria came begging for money. The Habsburg ruler had expensive tastes and empty coffers. Jacob offered him a loan, but with conditions. As collateral, he didn't want land or jewels. He wanted something far more valuable: control of silver and copper mines in Tyrol. This was Jacob's genius. While other merchants lent money and hoped for repayment, Jacob took control of the means of production. Within years, he had established a near monopoly on European copper trade. He partnered with a Hungarian businessman named Hans Thurs and opened mines across Central Europe, in Tyrol, Upper Hungary, and Silesia. They built smelting plants and distribution centers from Breslau to Krakow. Copper flowed through Jacob's hands like water, and with it came unimaginable wealth. He wasn't just rich, he controlled a commodity that every army in Europe desperately needed. By 1519, Jakob Fugger had become indispensable to Europe's most powerful family, the Habsburgs. He had financed Emperor Maximilian I for decades, turning modest loans into political leverage. But Maximilian's death that January created the opportunity of a lifetime. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire was up for grabs. This wasn't a hereditary position. It was elected by 7 prince-electors, and they expected to be paid handsomely for their votes. 4 candidates emerged: Charles of Habsburg, Francis I of France, Henry V of England, and Frederick of Saxony. The problem: Charles was already King of Spain, but he was only 19 years old and desperately needed this title to legitimize his authority. Francis I of France wanted it to expand his power. The electors saw a bidding war and prepared to get rich. Jakob Fugger made a calculated decision that would change history. He organized a consortium of German and Italian bankers and raised an astronomical sum: 850,000 guilders, equivalent to over $100 million today, or roughly 400 kilograms of pure gold. Of this staggering amount, Jacob personally provided more than 550,000 guilders from his own fortune. This wasn't charity, it was an investment. On June 28, 1519, Charles was unanimously elected Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ruler of an empire stretching from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to the Americas, the first empire in history where the sun never set, and Jakob Fugger owned him. With Charles V's election, Jakob Fugger reached the peak of his power. The young emperor owed him over 600,000 guilders, a debt so massive that Charles could never refuse him. Jacob used this leverage brilliantly. When the Imperial Diet of 1523 proposed laws to restrict trading monopolies, laws that would have destroyed Jacob's copper empire, he sent that infamous letter to the emperor. In it, Jacob reminded Charles in the bluntest terms possible: It is well known that your imperial majesty could not have gained the Roman crown without my help. I can prove it by writings of your majesty's own agents. The message was clear: you owe me, and I expect to be repaid, not just in money, but in political favors. The proposed restrictions were immediately dropped. No one dared challenge a man who held the emperor's debt. But Jacob's influence extended even beyond kings. He financed Pope Julius's recruitment of the Swiss Guard in 1505, the same guard that still protects the Vatican today. Between 1508 and 1524, the Fugger Company leased the Roman mint itself, manufacturing 66 types of coins for 4 different popes. Jakob also inadvertently triggered one of history's most consequential events: his involvement in the sale of indulgences, essentially selling forgiveness for sins to fund the church. So outraged a German monk named Martin Luther that he wrote his 95 Theses in 1517, sparking the Protestant Reformation that would split Christianity forever. Chtr 6t Menandi Hesawai. Despite his immense wealth, Jakob Fugger was described by contemporaries as surprisingly dull. He wasn't flamboyant or extravagant like many wealthy merchants. He was methodical, calculating, and utterly focused on business. In 1498, a Grandburger's daughter, but they had no children. Jakob's palace in Augsburg, built between 1512 and 1515, told a different story. The Fugger user was 4 stories of Renaissance splendor, with fountains in the courtyard and heating in every room, an unheard of luxury in the early 1500s. But perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't a palace, it was a housing project. In 1516, Jakob founded the Fuggery, the world's oldest social housing complex still in use today. It was built to provide homes for Augsburg's working poor. To live there, residents only had to be Catholic, have lived in Augsburg for 2 years, and pray daily for the Fugger family. The annual rent, 1 Rhenish guilder, less than $1 in today's currency. The Fuggery survived the 30 Years' War, Napoleon, and 2 world wars. Today, 500 years later, 142 apartments still house Augsburg's poorest citizens at virtually no cost. It stands as a testament that even the richest man in history understood that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to help others. Chtr 7a. Jakob Fugger died on December 30, 25 at the age of 66. His personal fortune was valued at 232,652 guilders, approximately 2% of all European GDP. But his death marked the beginning of the end for his empire. His nephew Anton took over and tried to maintain the business, but the very thing that made the Fuggers rich became their downfall. They were too closely tied to the Habsburgs. As Spain repeatedly defaulted on debts and Hungarian mines declined, the Fugger fortune slowly evaporated. By 1546, more than half of the company's assets were tied up in Spanish loans that would never be repaid. The Spanish branch went bankrupt in 1557. After Anton's death in 1560, branches were sold off, mines returned to the Habsburgs, and by 1658, the Fugger Company was dissolved completely, yet the family survived. Descendants of Jakob Fugger still live in Germany today, managing charitable foundations and maintaining the Fuggery. But the immense wealth that once rivaled kingdoms, gone, consumed by the very empire it helped create. So why don't we remember Jakob Fugger? Why isn't his name as famous as the Medici, the Rothschilds, or the Rockefellers? Perhaps it's because Jakob Fugger represented something uncomfortable: the raw, unfiltered power of money. He didn't conquer nations with armies. He didn't paint masterpieces or build monuments to his own glory. He simply understood that in the emerging capitalist world, whoever controlled the money controlled everything. Jakob Fugger invented modern capitalism as we know it. He created consolidated financial statements, sent auditors to branch offices, established an intelligence network to gather market information, and demanded interest on loans, something that was technically illegal under church law before he convinced the Pope to change the rules. He proved that money could buy anything, even emperors. And perhaps that's why history forgot him, because remembering Jakob Fugger means acknowledging a truth we'd rather ignore: that for 500 years, nothing has really changed. If you found the story of Jakob Fugger as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel dives deep into forgotten history, the stories of people who changed the world but somehow disappeared from our textbooks. In the comments, let me know. If you had Jakob Fugger's wealth and power, what would you do with it? Would you be a kingmaker, a philanthropist, or something else entirely? And remembers, the richest person in history wasn't a tech billionaire, an oil baron, or a pharaoh. It was a German merchant who understood one simple truth: whoever holds the debt holds the power. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.